And particularly in terms of the topic that Robin's going to talk about, it's something that many of us in the room that I know, it's great that some people here I don't know, is that it is the great question of our time. We have the planetary crisis. You know, many of us live in jurisdictions, whether it's in Britain and Ireland, where we've had our parliaments declare climate and ecological emergencies. But then, forgive my French, WTF question mark. What's happened? So we have the declaration of an emergency that a growth-based capitalist fossil fuel system that Robin's going to talk about is heading us towards hell on earth. I don't want to rain on anybody's parade, although it is raining outside. For those of you who keep up to date with the climate change, and again, Robin might reflect on this, in my own view from reading the climate science, 1.5 degrees dead. We will not keep global average temperatures below 1.5 degrees. That is not a counsel of despair. It just shows you that we've had 30 years of these international agreements. The last two are going to be in fossil fuel countries in the Middle East. Bad optics, to say the least. But you've got to remember, these conferences of parties that happened, you know, we had them in Copenhagen, where Obama didn't come in and solve the day. Paris 2015, where the 1.5 degree target was met. Then we had COP26 in Glasgow, where the ridiculous slogan was, keep 1.5 alive. So what I'm trying to tell you is that we have these political, rhetorical declarations of emergencies. The science is getting ever more clearer to, you know, combine with our anecdotal sense. Something is up with the weather. You know, we mustn't confuse changes in the weather with climate change in much longer periods of alterations to the atmosphere. That's why I'm really looking forward to Robin's talk, because even within the academy, too often we see that people say, oh, what's the cause of the climate crisis? Oh, it's burning fossil fuels. And the conversation ends there. So essentially what we're presented with, and this is certainly the case on the island of Ireland and Britain and elsewhere, is we're going to transition from a corporate-owned fossil fuel system to a corporate-owned renewable energy system. This is what I call biofueling the Hummer. So we're going to take out the bad fossil fuels and stick in clean, green, renewable energy. And nobody's saying that the root cause of the problem, and that's what radical means, folks. Many people think radical just means you're out there like an anarchist throwing a bomb shaped like a Christmas pudding. That kind of image in our head. Radical simply means, from the Latin sense of getting to the root of the problem. The roots lie in political economy. Therefore, that's where the solutions lie as well. So I'd like to all ask you to put your hands together and give Robin a warm Belfast welcome as he gives us a talk on economic system change or climate change. So, Robin, over to you. Good amount of time. Absolutely happy to play now. So I'm going to start by giving you a warning that the title of this talk is a little misleading. I want you to think about these three questions. First one is global neoliberal capitalism now on track to all too soon trigger catastrophic and irreversible climate change? Just think about that for a second. Second question, is there an alternative economic system which would no longer do this, but instead not only prevent climate change, but adequately protect the natural environment endlessly, forever? There's a second question. Now here's the third question. Does this mean that the solution to climate change is economic system change, i.e. to replace capitalism with some appropriate version of, let's call it eco-socialism? And I think the advertised title of my talk implies that that's what I'm going to tell you.
And I think many anti-capitalists would argue that. That would be the way they would argue the issue. I think the answers to the first and second questions are both a resounding yes. But I think the answer to the third question is an emphatic no. And I'm anticipating that we are going to have some disagreement about this. Okay. I do owe an apology, Professor Berry, for having listed the talk under that title. That is the title that over 90% of people who are both anti-capitalist and pro-environment would choose. But I wouldn't choose that title. And here, I'm going to give you the punchline before I even begin. The problem with that title is time. The problem is possibly catastrophic and irreversible climate change may be as little as only a decade away, or maybe 2 decades away. As much as I would like to believe otherwise, and as much as I've spent most of my life arguing that capitalism is a terrible economic system and that we can build an economy that is far better than that, I cannot convince myself that economic system change in the vast majority of the global economy is more than a decade away. So what are the implications? What are the conclusions I draw from this? I think to ignore these 2 facts is to literally behave like the proverbial ostrich who sticks its head in the sand when danger approaches. I think we must prevent cataclysmic climate change before it's too late. And that means even while most economies in the world are still capitalist economies. I think we cannot wait for economic system change to prevent catastrophic climate change. I just don't think that it's realistic to think it's going to come fast enough to do that. So maybe a better title for the talk I'm going to give today would have been Climate Change and Economic System Change. What is their relationship? I just want to talk about why I think this is so hard for many of my radical colleagues to grapple with. If I'm right about this, if I'm right that it's as obvious as it seems to me, why is it so hard for so many anti-capitalists to sort of recognize this? And here are among the reasons. We anti-capitalists want everyone to believe that what we want is the solution to all problems. That way they'll join and work with us to bring about our goal, economic system change. I've been trying to convince people to do that for 40 years or more. Second thing is, in numerous ways, the capitalist economic system is responsible for creating climate change and other forms of environmental degradation as well. And I've argued this for decades in many, many publications. And I also think it's true that only a well-designed eco-socialist economy can really adequately protect the environment over the long run. And I've argued that as well. So where does this leave me? Here is where I remain still optimistic, not based on what's happened so far, but simply based on what is still possible. I think that fortunately, even at this late date, even while most economies remain capitalist, we can still prevent cataclysmic climate change before it's too late. Is the clock ticking? You bet. Have we actually responded at this point on a scale that is anything close that would actually bring this off. No, we have not. I'm painfully aware of that too. But I do believe that if we, who believe in economic system change, ever expect anyone to listen to us on any subject, we socialists must put our shoulder to the wheel, along with everyone else striving to prevent climate change in the here and now, before it's too late. And not do something that will appear to people as sitting on the sidelines, telling everyone else their efforts are in vain as long as capitalism persists. But I do believe that as long as we do put our shoulder to the wheel and work with others to prevent climate change, even while capitalism continues to reign, and we do that without reservation, without hesitation, without caveat, there is no reason we cannot also explain all the disastrous ways in which capitalism creates and aggravates environmental destruction, because it does. And there's no reason we cannot also explain why and how a well-designed eco-socialist economy would adequately protect the natural environment, because it can. And I believe even while a properly designed eco-socialist economy, which is environmentally sustainable, could also continue to raise living standards for everyone. And here I'm going to step on some other toes. And I know that'll come up in discussion, and that I'm hoping that it will. Contrary to what at least some people in the steady state and degrowth movement would have people believe. So let me talk a little bit about preventing climate change before it's too late. Preventing climate change requires international cooperation. I'm going to explain briefly why I think that's clear. And I'll even talk a little bit about what that international cooperation is going to have to look like. Preventing climate change also requires advanced economies to launch what in the United States we now call a Green New Deal. And I'll talk a little bit about what that looks like. And where, you may not know, but it actually has already started to happen in the United States. Not because we're ahead of anybody else. We're usually behind everybody else. And I'm going to argue that all of that can be done even while most countries still have capitalist economies. So, international cooperation. No country can solve the problem of climate change on its own. Why? Because reducing carbon emissions is what we economists call a global public good, which creates a very perverse incentive for every country to attempt to do what economists call free ride. That is, not reduce its own emissions, but instead wait and benefit when other countries reduce their emissions. That's one reason this is such a difficult problem to solve. It's very difficult to imagine a solution to climate change without some effective form of international cooperation. So to prevent what Garrett Hardin famously called this tragedy of the commons requires effective international cooperation. Talk a little bit about what it would have to look like. We're going to need an international climate agreement. We're going to need it to be effective, equitable, and efficient. And I'm going to stop right here and tell you, if you go no place else, if you read nothing else, this is the one thing that you should go and look at. There's an organization called EcoEquity. That's their website. It is a treasure trove of incredibly useful information about everything that has gone on in the international climate negotiations and what instead is going to have to go on instead. But in any case, Effective means by 2050, annual global greenhouse gas emissions is going to have to be down at least 90% below what their level was in 1990. At this point, everybody's saying, why is everybody talking about 1990? It's just that that was the benchmark where all of the calculations and all the comparisons began. Equitable means that national responsibilities, what's the responsibility of a particular country for emission reductions? Going to have to be allocated according to various countries' differential responsibilities and capabilities. It is not true that every country is equally responsible for having created the incipient disaster. It is also not true that every country has the economic wherewithal and the organizational wherewithal to contribute to solving the problem. There are huge differences in national responsibilities and capabilities. And unless an international cooperation takes account of that, it's not going to happen. And I am an economist. Efficient means reduction should take place wherever they cost the least. What would an international treaty that accomplishes those three things look like? I think the size and speed of global emission reductions, that's the global reductions, should be chosen based on information provided by climate scientists. What they tell us about global reductions, in order to make it highly probable that average global temperatures will not rise by more than 1.5 degrees centigrade. You're right. 1.5 is gone. We're listening to a talk from somebody who is on the science side of this at Portland State University a month ago. So we are already to the point where that is probably a fleeting goal. That doesn't necessarily mean it's a bad slogan to stick to. But in any case, how much do those global emissions have to be reduced? I think at this point, that's something that we need to listen to the scientists about. The distribution of national reductions should be done in accord with differential responsibility and capability. This was a serious intellectual problem. It went unsolved for decades. And the problem was how to make differential responsibility and capability. By the way, those words have been in every international agreement going back to Rio de Janeiro in 1992. Which is rather astounding, because there's certainly a lot of governments and heads of governments, particularly the United States government, that would have loved to take those words, out of the climate negotiations and meetings. And we should be very, very happy that those words were never taken out. But the problem is, well, how do you quantify that? How do you make differential responsibility and capability of countries operational? How do you quantify that? Well, fortunately, climate equity experts at organizations like Eco-Equity and elsewhere at this point have now solved this intellectual problem. And they've been able to calculate what are national fair shares of global emission reductions. And you can go on their website and you can see the calculations. And then you can compare those calculations with what pledges are coming in from various countries. Still talking about what sort of international treaty or understanding, whether it's called a treaty or not. Think of it more as an agreement at this point. This is highly controversial on the left. Country governments should be allowed, if they wish, to certify emission reduction credits for sources within their territories to sell in the international carbon market. And then when calculating whether or not a country has done its fair share to prevent climate change, reduction credits purchased by any entity within the country should be subtracted from the country's reduction responsibility, while any credits sold by an entity within the country should be added to the country's reduction responsibility. I know nothing has repulsed anti-capitalists more than the idea of buying and selling carbon reduction credits. But if you set the program up the way I just outlined, there are no compelling objections. And without an international carbon market, the global cost of avoiding climate change will be greatly increased, which means without the kind of international carbon market I'm talking about, it will be far less likely that we reduce global emissions enough to avoid climate disaster. So I know this is the third rail on the left, carbon markets. And I also am not defending any of the carbon markets that have been created, which have largely been shams. They have been. But the question remains, are we going to solve this problem without them? I don't think so. And is there a way to structure them so that they actually serve the function we need, which is to reduce the overall cost of actually managing to avoid disaster? This is a little bit about why certified emissions reduction credits work. It is very difficult to determine how many credits to award any individual applicant for emission reductions. On the other hand, it's easy to measure annual national emissions. And it has to be done in any case to monitor any kind of international climate agreement. So there's one thing that's very difficult to measure. There's one thing that's very easy to measure, and we have to measure it anyway. As long as national emissions are capped and compliance with national caps are enforced, any mistakes that a country government may make when awarding emission reduction credits cannot undermine overall global emission reductions, and that's all that need concern the international community. Why aren't other approaches going to work? Basically because charity and guilt are far less powerful incentive in today's world than self-interest. Because of that, negotiations over climate reparations, climate debt, technology transfers, and adaptation funds, as much as I support them, as much as they are good, as much as we should try to achieve them, they are going to continue to yield much less than what is needed and deserved. And what's going to happen is do-gooders will continue to accomplish little by focusing on these strategies. On the other hand, if we instead concentrate on the fight to set national emission caps fairly, and we now have the information available to calculate what they are, self-interest is going to drive emission sources in more developed countries to purchase certified emission reduction credits from sellers in less developed countries, and thereby provide less developed countries the opportunity to achieve economic development in an environmentally sustainable way. Is this difficult? Oh, yes. But it's not impossible. And there has actually finally been some progress on the international front. So nothing I've suggested solves the political problem, which is convincing countries that they must take responsibility for their fair share of reductions. But the good news is that if you look at the pledges that have come in, delegation from countries which are pledging to do their fair share of reductions, they now are confronting countries which are still not pledging to do their fair share, with increasing effect at the international climate meetings. Yeah, I'm going to make the China detour. No, China is not the big problem. This is particularly popular in the US. And China has now passed the US in annual greenhouse gas emissions. That doesn't mean China is the big problem. There are only two countries were responsible more than 10% of global emissions in 2015. China was responsible for 30%, and the US was responsible for 15%. So yes, China emitted more in 2015 than the US, and it continues to do so. But the population of the US was only 325 million in 2015. The population of China was 1.4 billion, more than 4 times as large. The relevant metric when you're thinking about who's responsible for creating the problem is emissions per capita, which in 2015 was only 7.7 tons in China, but was 16.1 tons in the US. It's actually worse than that in terms of China is not the culprit. Since greenhouse gases can remain in the upper atmosphere for over 100 years, what produces climate change is cumulative emissions, not the annual emissions. If you compare cumulative emissions from 1970 to 2015, the US ranks first. Countries that now comprise the European Union rank second, and China is a very distant third. Even though China has a much larger population than either the US or the EU. How about the pledges? At the Paris meetings in 2015, the US pledged to reduce its annual greenhouse gas emissions, fell short of its fair share by 4.2 metric tons per person. So the US made a pledge, and if you compare that to what our fair share pledge would have been, we were 4.2 metric tons per person short. Chinese pledge exceeded their fair share of annual greenhouse gas emissions by 0.2 metric tons per person. So, okay, I want to go back to the big picture, but just let's get the China boogeyman story out of there. So there's both good news and bad news on the international negotiating fronts. The pledges from most LDCs are the good news. Because if you look at the pledges coming from the lesser developed countries, they have more or less, I mean, it's a rare LDC that has not pledged to do their fair share. Well, then the only problem is if we could just get the more developed countries to do likewise, we'd be well on our way to avoiding cataclysmic climate change. The bad news is that no MDC, there's not a single more developed country that's pledged to do their fair share. And the largest MDC, the US, is still under the Biden administration the worst offender. I think the bad news may contain a silver lining. I think there's a way to reduce more developed countries and intransigence. If you take a look at those NDC pledges, their pledge to reduce their domestic emissions is probably close to what is required. The problem is that MDC's greater responsibility and capability requires them to pay for more emission reduction than they can accomplish reasonably cheaply through domestic reductions. Now, there's no reason that MDCs cannot make up for the remainder of their fair share of reductions at a reasonable cost if emission sources and MDCs are allowed to buy certified emission credits from sources in LDCs. There's a recent study by the Political Economy Research Institute at the University of Massachusetts. That's another person who you should certainly read on this subject, Robert Pohl. He and Noam Chomsky are now jointly publishing on this issue. And that study estimates that the cost of both domestic reductions and credits purchased for reductions elsewhere for the United States to meet its fair share would be roughly 1.5% of GDP, which is certainly far less than 3.5% of GDP the US currently spends on its military. It's not that big a price tag. What about these domestic Green New Deals? Replacing fossil fuels with renewables, transforming transportation industry and agriculture to be much more energy efficient, rebuilding our entire built infrastructure to conserve energy is going to be an immense historic undertaking. What's needed is, if we're going to avoid unacceptable climate change, will be an immense technological reboot on the scale of what the US, Europe, Japan, and the Soviet Union did during World War II. It's not unprecedented to make mammoth changes in your economy for some absolutely dire need. Just as those countries move quickly from peacetime to wartime production, MDCs are going to have to transform what we should think of as their fossil fuel stands into renew conserva stands. In the US, we have a name for this historic transformation. We call it the Green New Deal. And while the Biden administration has barely begun a Green New Deal at the national level, it is already underway in states such as California, Washington, and I'm proud to say in Oregon, where Democratic governors and state legislatures have managed to launch Green New Deals in their states, even while national legislation is now slow to materialize. This is a really important question to ask. Can beginning at a local level work as a solution to this problem? Or to put it differently, when is small not beautiful? As I've already explained, the free rider problem suggests that any country reducing emissions unilaterally will actually have little effect on climate change while bearing the costs that citizens of other countries live with. The same logic applies to any state in the US acting unilaterally. Worse still, when states act to reduce, states inside the US, when they act to reduce emissions unilaterally, businesses may relocate to other states and take jobs with them. As a matter of fact, designing unilateral state climate policy is largely a matter of avoiding this undesirable effect. For example, the Clean Energy and Jobs Bill in Oregon exempted emissions in agriculture and forestry and gave emission permits away free of charge to manufacturing companies to keep firms who are the major employers in the state from relocating to other states. It is harder to solve at the local level. All of which is why economists have long argued that climate change should be addressed globally and not through local initiatives. Our reasoning process, our logic has led us to that conclusion. And I've emphasized that at some point it's going to have to be done at the international level too. But you know, we economists were wrong about something. Despite advice from the dismal science, individual countries have done more voluntarily to reduce emissions than international treaties and agreements have required. And some individual states have done more to reduce emissions than the US federal government requires. Why? Why did Oregon do this? The answer lies in the most important rule of development economics. Whoever gets ahead of the technological learning curve will prosper, and whoever falls behind will become an economic backwater and suffer accordingly. If there's a future worth living, that will be a future that looks like Renew Conservistan, not fossil fuelistan. Which is why Oregonians are being smart to reduce our carbon emissions, even while other states lag behind. It's smart to do whatever heavy political lifting is necessary to get started on the transition to Renew Conservistan as quickly as possible. And that's why more states, including some red states like Texas and South Dakota, are following California, Oregon, and Washington State to do just this. It's unfortunate that so many of us economists were wrong, because it has proven far easier to begin the transition from fossil fuelistan economics to Renew Conservistan economics locally, in blue states and blue cities in particular, than it is proven easy to make progress on the international and national levels. But I don't want to fool anybody. Preventing climate disaster will require scaling up very, very soon. Eventually, it's going to require a massive federal Green New Deal that goes far beyond what the Biden administration was able to push through before Democrats lost control of the House in 2022. And it will require similar Green New Deals in all the other MDCs. And it will require an international agreement, something along the lines of the one I've outlined. The problem is not that we do not know what solutions look like at the international, national, and even state levels. The problem is not that we must resort to untested technologies like carbon capture and storage and geoengineering, at least not yet. The problem is simply overcoming the political obstacles that stand in our way of launching a program like the one I've outlined, both internationally and domestically. And make no mistake, the most important obstacles are the global fossil fuel industry and in the United States, the Republican Party. But all this could be done without replacing capitalism globally or in the United States. Now, I want to talk a little bit about eco-socialism and what it would look like. In the aftermath of the failure of essentially planned communist economies, dozens of proposals or models for an alternative to capitalism have appeared in the literature. And I am the co-creator of one such model, known as a participatory economy. But just because proponents want or claim their model would prove to be environmentally sustainable doesn't mean it actually would be. You really have to look and see. So in the remainder of my talk, what I want to do is explain concretely how would our proposal for a participatory economy actually adequately protect the natural environment. We've now added what economists call an incentive-compatible pollution demand revealing mechanism to the participatory annual planning procedure. And I'll briefly outline how it works in a second. But long-run environmental planning is also going to be necessary. Long-run environmental planning faces dilemmas not encountered when you're doing annual planning. And they're going to require their own solutions. We now propose some concrete procedures for how to create, approve, and most importantly, update long-run environmental plans. So I'm going to try and briefly explain what those proposals look like. Here's the way that annual participatory planning works in brief. There's some board that announces whatever the current estimates of opportunity costs of using all natural resources, all categories of labor, all capital goods available for use, as well as the current estimates of social costs of producing goods and services. So there's an announcement of these are our current estimates of what those opportunity and social costs are. Then neighborhood consumer councils respond by making consumption requests. And worker councils respond by making production proposals. That is, what are the outputs they want to produce and what are the inputs they want permission to use to do that. This iteration facilitation board just adds up all the demands and supplies for final goods, intermediate goods, capital goods, natural resources, categories of labor, and then adjusts its estimate of its opportunity cost up or down in proportion to the degree of whatever the excess demand or supply was in that round of proposals. And you just repeat this until there's no longer excess demand or supply for any good or service. In other words, until what an economist calls a feasible plan. The procedure is actually quite simple in its outcomes. As we originally proposed it back in 1991, none of that would have taken care of pollution and environmental externalities. So we've added something to that annual planning process that's designed to do that. We've added this pollution demand revealing mechanism. First thing you have to do is you have to add pollutants to our list of produced goods. Well, I know, of course, they're produced bads, but that's okay. And in each iteration of the planning procedure, the IFB has to quote the current estimate of the damage caused by releasing an additional unit of each pollutant, along with the current estimates of all the other opportunity and social costs. So you've got to include these pollutants in the annual planning procedure. Second thing you have to do is when worker councils make proposals, they must also include the amount of any pollutants they wish to emit. And then the damages from emissions can be calculated by multiplying the number of units of a pollutant the worker council proposes to emit times the current estimate of the damage from one unit as announced by the IFB. So these damages are going to be added to the cost of using the inputs the enterprises request when calculating the overall social cost of that enterprise's proposal. And that's what then is compared with the social benefits of the outputs it proposes to move to supply. Third thing you have to do is you have to create something we call communities of affected parties, which comprise all who are damaged by emission of a particular pollutant. For example, there would be a community of affected parties for volatile organic compounds and nitrous oxide emissions that cause smog in the Los Angeles area. You have to include these CAPs, these communities of affected parties, along with the worker and consumer councils and federations as actors who participate in each round of the planning procedure. So worker councils propose how much of a pollutant they want to emit, knowing they're going to be charged for those emissions, an amount equal to the current estimate of the damages. Communities of affected parties propose how many units of a pollutant they are willing to allow to be released. So we propose empowering the victims of pollution to say how much they're willing to tolerate. Well, why wouldn't you just say none? Well, sometimes, taking into account that the community of affected parties will be compensated by an amount equal to the current estimate of the damages. So we're basically proposing a system where victims of pollution have the power to say how much they're willing to tolerate in exchange for they are going to be compensated for whatever it is the damage that they have to put up with. Well, in Chapter 7 of Democratic Economic Planning, I proved that under standard assumptions economists make about preferences and technologies, that once this PDRM is incorporated into the annual planning procedure, the planning procedure will achieve all of the following. It will reduce pollution to reasonably efficient levels, i.e., it will allow emissions up to the point where the marginal social cost of emissions is equal to their marginal social benefit. It will satisfy the polluter pays principle, since worker councils are charged for the damage their emissions generate. It will compensate the victims of pollution by giving them consumption credit for the damages that they say we're willing to suffer in exchange for that compensation. And most importantly, it will actually induce victims of pollution to truthfully reveal how much they're damaged, because this mechanism is what economists call incentive compatible. Now, I want to include an important caveat. Devising a pollution demand revealing mechanisms that will induce victims to reveal truthfully how much they believe pollution will damage them, it's not a trivial accomplishment. As far as I know, I don't think any other post-capitalist model is done. But this mechanism is only useful for pollutants whose effects are relatively well understood by victims. And most importantly, for pollutants which do not primarily affect future generations who can't be present during the annual planning procedure. What I'm saying is, it's a really good thing, but it doesn't take care of all the problems we face. Because there are obviously many pollutants which do not fit this description, most notably greenhouse gas emissions. But we've now proposed how to create and revise long-run environmental plans to address pollutants which will affect many generations to come. So let me say something briefly about that. So in Chapter 14 of Democratic Economic Planning, I present a concrete proposal for how to organize long-run environmental planning, which maximizes popular participation of worker and consumer generations, taking both access to information, who knows best what is likely to be the future effect of something or what's likely to happen in the future, and motivation of participants into account. It induces participants alive today to behave as honest brokers on behalf of future generations. It uses results from subsequent annual plans to identify the inevitable mistakes in estimations of key parameters on a long-run environmental plan, and then goes about showing how you can update long-run environmental plans accordingly to mitigate welfare losses. Now I'm really going to poke some bears. Eco-socialism. Read carefully. As far as I know, everyone proposing a model for 21st century socialism now claims their proposal would adequately protect the natural environment. Unfortunately, what proponents wish for and believe to be the case may not actually be true when you look at the proposals really carefully. As far as I know, there's no other post-capitalist proposal in the literature which would actually reduce emissions of pollutants to efficient levels annually, much less protect the interest of future generations by preventing environmental deterioration over the long run. In the appendix to my most recent book, I present and then evaluate 5 other proposals for 21st century socialism that's in the literature. And one of the things that I'm very careful to evaluate them for is, well, yes, I know you say that this is going to adequately protect the environment, but is there good reason to believe that what you would propose would actually do so? Now I'll really provoke the bear. Steady staters and degrowthers are wrong. How could, my claim is that a participatory economy could adequately protect the natural environment and still raise economic living standards indefinitely. Now, I think this does not mean that this is not true of every person in the steady state movement or every person in the degrowth movement. Some people are much more careful about how they state their conclusions than others. But there's certainly many people in those two movements who don't think that's possible. They think that's literally an impossibility. As long as technological changes increase environmental throughput efficiency, as much as they increase labor productivity, increases in productivity and therefore economic well-being can continue to increase indefinitely without doing further damage to the environment. You don't believe me? Well, first of all, I proved this is a theorem. It's published in an academic journal subject to very strenuous peer review, I can tell you that. Consider this. It's actually not the past 2 years. But in 2 recent years in the US, people drove more miles, yet carbon emissions from autos fell. In the United States, in an actual 2-year time period, people drove more miles, and yet carbon emissions from autos fell. Why? Because even at our slow pace, we have replaced enough gas-burning vehicles with EVs to have turned the tide on auto emissions while enjoying more rider miles. Now, I'm not arguing for a transportation system built on the automobile with one person driving around. But that is what steady staters and degrowthers would have you believe is somehow a logical impossibility. Not only not a logical impossibility, there's an example of where it actually happened. Stop there. Good enough there.
That's great.
And hopefully we can have a nice discussion.
Great. Thank you. This small bear is the host, but I will maintain my provocation and open up the questions or comments from the floor. And also, Callum, if you can keep an eye online. So for the folks online, if you want to ask a question, please put it into the chat and Callum can speak it out. Oh, anyway, over to people in the audience. Yes.
Oh, sorry, was that?
Oh,
I was a hand going up. I wasn't sure if it was on me. I'm curious about the, sorry, I've forgotten the exact term, but your version of the carbon credit markets, whether or not, or what it is about them that means they're not necessarily as inherently unstable as other markets or some carbon markets have been.
Look, any market can be unstable, and I'm an advocate for an economic system that no longer has markets. So in some ways, I should be the last person out there arguing for a market as a solution to anything. Because if you listen to neoclassical economists, they will tell you that markets are a solution to every economic problem. And I am firmly convinced and have been for 40 years that nothing could be farther from the truth. So I don't recommend markets unless circumstances are dire. And if we're going to have to solve climate change when we still have a global market system, then I think that if they can be made to accomplish something we need to accomplish, then we should go ahead and use them. Then we need to just bite the bullet and realize we need to go ahead and use them. There's an added problem, which is the carbon markets that have been out there for the past 20, 30 years have largely been a sham. And then the question is, but is it possible to design an international carbon market that isn't a sham? And the key to doing it is being sure that you can enforce, that you can measure national emissions, and you can enforce that national emissions will actually be abided by. If you can do that, then even if somebody sells bogus carbon credits, it's not that if somebody sells bogus carbon credits, there isn't a victim of the scam. So suppose you have some business in a country, and it claims that it's doing something that's reducing carbon emissions in that country, and it goes to get these credits, and it says, it goes to its own national government and says, please certify these so I can sell them in the international market. And they're totally bogus. And they get sold. Well, who's damaged and who's not? Well, first of all, if they're bogus, then the measured emissions from the country are going to show up as there were no emissions. Somebody inside that country is going to basically pay the price. So it's not that there isn't going to be injustice when bogus emissions or credits are sold. But the injustice is going to be whoever in that country has to make up for the fact that the credits were sold, but now there actually have to be reductions. But from the international community's point of view, overall reductions will not have been compromised. So what I'm arguing is, I'm the last person in the universe to resort to markets. But if you don't have but is it possible to design international carbon markets so that they would work reasonably well in this emergency? Yes, it is. Well, how important is it to do that? There are various estimates that they vary, but the overall cost of reducing emissions globally by as much as we have to, which is 90% by 2050, to get global emissions reduced by that much, how much will it cost all the citizens of the world? It could cost twice as much if you don't have these carbon markets. Now, one attitude that an environmentalist would, so it costs twice as much, who cares? Because the political resistance will be significantly greater if it costs twice as much as it has to. I mean, that's the truth about why I care. I care because I know how much political resistance to doing the amount of reductions that are needed would be increased if we do it more expensively than it could have been done. And I do believe that if properly designed, an international carbon market can considerably reduce the overall cost of accomplishing what has to be accomplished.
One more from the room, and then we may go online. Anybody? Kenya.
Hello, glad to give you directions to hear. That was a fantastic presentation. I found it really, really challenging, I have to say. A lot of the first very great presentation as well. I think from your own perspective and everything you've written in the past. The position that you articulated at the very beginning is one that just first of all I want to start with a comment and a question, right? I think it's a very, very sensible, sort of well articulated set of proposals. Potentially should happen. But I don't think they will happen for all the reasons that you've begun to outline about the nature of cost and all of that, because that's the perennial thing when it comes to the social relations of capitalism. It's the cost of things. So I just and also as well, if you look at the sort of the trajectory, the direction of travel in terms of the broader environmental policy environment, nothing's changing. Nothing's really changing to any significant degree, and I think we're going to a fairly dystopian path. I think that's the path that we'll go down, where we're going to have to make these really horrific choices in 10, 20 years down the line. But this is the second part is my question now, right? And it's really a comment on the way in which you structured the presentation, which I thought was really interesting. In other words, what I got from it was almost like a sort of a race analogy. Where you presented this set of proposals, which is almost like the start of a race. This is what we each can do now. And then at the very end of your presentation, you gave us an overview of PowerPoint, of the principles of that. This is almost like the destination in terms of where we need to get to. This is how our communities should be run. What interests me is that sort of time-space gap. You know, how do you get from A to B? How do you run that race? What are the steps that need to be taken in order to get there? Because, as you said, you'll have to have, in the destination part, there can't be a market in that way. Private property will probably be abolished. So what needs to be done, realistically speaking, down that timeline?
Then into the 21st century.
Where's the revolution proposals? Well, that's what I'm saying. Where does that sit?
I mean, maybe let me put it this way. We're really up against a rock and a hard place. We are perhaps a decade away from cataclysmic climate change. And we socialists, anti-capitalists, we're also up against a rock and a hard place. As much as we point out all the problems with capitalism, and point out that neoliberal capitalism is even worse than social democratic capitalism. Slow headway. We haven't exactly convinced any substantial portion, of the global community, of our way of seeing these things. So we're in a really bad spot in two different ways. And you could say, well, what it really comes down to is how you decide to work sort of depends on, which of these nuts is going to be the easiest or the hardest to crack. Because the outline what I just outlined is what we're going to have to do to prevent cataclysmic climate. That is no more, that's no mean achievement, and there's no guarantee we're going to pull it off. So you could just say, well, what are the chances of pulling that off? Are they really that much greater than the chances of, managing to create, convince enough people that we should start changing our economic systems? I would like nothing better, than to say, oh, the solution to the climate problem and every other environmental problem is we just have to fight for participatory economies in all the major economies of the world. I truly believe it would solve all those problems, as well as a host of others. I don't think it's responsible. I don't think it's realistic enough to be responsible. I'm not pessimistic about whether we're going to get major economic system change at some point in the 21st century. I'm not pessimistic about that. We have to actually get there. We have to avoid cataclysmic climate change to even get there. And that's essentially why I look and see, well, some people would have you believe it's impossible to avoid cataclysmic climate change even while the world has capitalist economies. And I just don't think that's true. It's not impossible. It's going to be incredibly difficult, but it's not impossible. And I think we're still very, very fortunate. It's probably, we don't do more, if we don't do significantly more in that regard than we have up until now, in the next 5 years, then it may be more. Then that possibility may have vanished. And that is one of the unfortunate things. I used to always ask myself, well, what if humans are just very inefficient and slow, to solve racism or to solve sexism? But that's very frustrating. Or to solve class exploitation. Well, that's really frustrating. And who pays the cost of that? Minorities and women and workers. But in a sense, humanity, in those situations, we can give ourselves an incomplete. Who's writing the check for the incomplete? Took you longer? It's the people who are the victims that we could have done it faster and we should have done it faster. Mother Nature don't give no incompletes. We're in kind of a different ballgame here.
Before I bring somebody in online, I was going to follow up on Damien's point. You mentioned class there, the role of trade unions. So I think what Damien was asked about was strategy, the agency, the actual how. Is it going to be a coalition of Greta Thunberg, greening trade unions, student movements? I think that's what you were kind of getting at.
Yeah, what's the contingency if the proposals, the sensible proposals you put don't happen?
Okay, you're right. And let me. I'll be really brief in answering that. It's a lot harder to figure out how to design a desirable economy than early socialist thought. Early socialists thought, we're the capitalists and it's all ours, and it's not going to be that hard to figure out how to, how we can manage, how workers can manage their interrelations. If the history of 20th century socialism teaches us nothing else, it's just intellectually harder than anybody thought it was in the beginning. That's still incredibly easier than coming up with successful strategies for doing things like stopping climate change and producing economic system change. And I do think that successful strategies are very country and time period specific. And there's fewer general rules. You remember, the Marxist-Leninists used to tell us that, well, it's all a science, and we're the ones that understand the science, so just listen to us and we'll tell you how to do it. Well, that was stupid. I mean, there's no Marxist-Leninist science to producing socialist revolution. But so on the subject of strategy, I'm very agnostic, and feel like, and I also quite frankly feel that's really that's the more difficult problem. That's the one that's harder to figure out. Not only harder to figure out and harder to implement. And I actually have been very careful not to even speak to that. But it doesn't mean that I don't understand that that's really the big problem.
It's almost like the way Marx said he wasn't inventing cookbook to the future. You're kind of saying it's similar around the theory of change, agency, that is not something you have any fixed views on. So I think that. Well, before I let you in, is something online?
Yeah, two
questions. Okay.
Could I follow up on that? Because
okay,
I might say something about this. So, like, I'm in DN25, Democracy in Europe movement, 2025, and we're in the middle of forming policy on how to transition Europe to post-capitalist society, which pretty much nobody's actually doing. And so I'll tell you one part of my view of how we do this in terms of transition. Okay, quickly. So for me, to just condense this down to like a few sentences, it centers on citizenship and debureaucratizing the state. So I think that, in my view, the one thread that runs right from neoliberal capitalism now to mature socialist society through a revolutionary period is taking actions to devolve power down to the masses of the citizens, so that we start. So it's not a withering away of the state, but it's supplanting the state with democratic governance by civil society through citizens' assemblies, citizen initiatives, local assemblies, and that. The idea being that we can create a positive feedback loop. We devolve more power down to the base of society, which empowers people to engage in statecraft to bring more power back to the base, and particularly with regard to ecology. I think that's really the only way that we can do that, and it's something that we get to start doing now. So that's my view of things. Although it's obviously more complicated.
We'll have to get you back up here, but you had me at revolutionary.
Yeah.
So the questions online.
The first comes from Matthew Monroe, who I know to be a PhD student here at Queen's. And it follows on quite nicely from the discussion so far, I think. Matthew asks, or says, the problem is not that the solutions are impossible or unachievable. The climate crisis is a communication crisis, where we are in a propaganda war with the fossil fuel industry and we aren't even on the battlefield. How do we address / counter the emotion-driven messaging that capitalism uses to drive what Michael Mann calls climate inactivism?
No, I think that's very perceptive. The fossil fuel industry is the most powerful industry in real-world capitalism and has been for more than a century. So, and they are smart, they are devious, they will stoop to anything, they will lie, they will cheat, they will bribe, and they have everything to lose, and they know it. All that stuff they have on the ground, you can't prevent cataclysmic climate change unless it just basically sits there. Most of us just got to sit there. So don't underestimate the opponent. And part of a successful strategy has to be a strategy of how do you beat an opponent that's that skilled, that has managed to buy that many politicians and put them in their pockets, that's managed to convince the media industry to just send out all sorts of obfuscation about absolutely everything. So I don't underestimate them. And none of us should. I want to add one thing. What if there had never been any oil or coal in planet Earth? And human societies had evolved and capitalism had come along. We'd have capitalism. It would be a capitalism without fossil fuels by assumption. It would still be markets, it would still be private enterprise, it would still be competition and greed, it would still be ugly, and I would still want participatory economies. But it's historical. We have a capitalism that evolved as a fossil fuel dependent capitalism that now has created a planetary problem that is a challenge to human civilization.
There's two interesting points on that before I put that person in. And Andreas Mann, who we may be aware of. So he has a book called Fossil Capital, which speaks to the point that you're making. At the early phase of capitalism, they had renewable energy sources. But the reason why early industrializing capitalists didn't choose them was because it meant they were fixed. It's actually a disciplining force on labor when you have a portable form of energy like coal, gas, and oil. So it's done for political reasons in terms of class politics. There's no reason why capitalism couldn't have developed in renewable energy basis. But of course, it's interesting in terms of issues of strategy and how do we combat the fossil fuel industry. Because of course, man's latest work is how to blow up pipelines, where we are now seriously seeing not just the American movie, which actually bears no resemblance to the book if you read the book, but still a piece of interesting filmography, is that there are serious people who now feel forced that the system destroying life, well, why not attack the physical infrastructure? I'm not advocating this, by the way, but it's interesting that as the climate crisis deepens, as our states do not respond adequately, as academia and universities, where are we in this? We're in a planetary crisis, and yet we in the academy are continuing in the business as usual manner. And so I am worried that people will, out of desperation, begin to take more violent action like that. And that has to be seriously considered. And the last thing I'd say, one of the reasons why most Marxists and socialists would not advocate violent revolution is because working class people are the ones who are going to be hurt. Not for any moral, or it's purely because it's going to, have a negative impact on the very people trying to protect. But it's interesting that Man, if you're interested, Fossil Capital, a few years ago, this more recent book, How to Blow Up a Pipeline, and there's a furious debate going on in the climate movement now between whether it's Just Stop Oil in Britain, Extinction Rebellion, or people now willing to countenance violence against physical infrastructure that are really clear. This is not violence against people, but actually against the infrastructure. And I can see that that's going to increase in the years ahead as the climate crisis gets worse. Anyway, enough from me.
Yes, we have a question from Rebecca Corbett, who asks, is there a role for wealth tax in Green New Deals, more specifically in more developed countries in capitalist societies?
Oh, bless you.
Yeah. I think if and when we have a future and we have economic historians to look back over the last 40 years, they'll say, well, there were two remarkable things. One was that we slowly came to awareness that we were on course to create cataclysmic climate change, and then they'll either write that we woke up barely in time to prevent it, or they won't be writing at all because it's going to be that bad. And the other thing that they will certainly document, is something that it finally took Thomas Piketty to sort of the light go off, that the increase in economic inequality of both income and wealth over the past 40 years is like totally unprecedented in the history of humanity. And it creates huge disparities of political power. And the top 1% has so much that funding is never a problem for any project that they think is in their interest. So, yes, is a wealth tax a great idea? Yes. So tax reform makes all the sense, and you could argue that without it, there's both not enough public revenues to do the kinds of things to solve the serious problems that we're talking about. And you could also argue that as long as that 1% is allowed to keep that, they're going to keep spending it in ways that are to the detriment of the rest of us. So on every ground, all of that makes sense. And for me, it's just a question of how much headway can you make on that campaign versus some other campaign. And that's why I'm very agnostic about political strategy. I also think anybody that comes and tells you, and this was one of the problems with the old communist sects, they always thought that they had this scientific way to figure out what's the perfect strategy for right now. And then all their members had to do that. And they had to tell everybody else to do that. First of all, some people are, when I go up and try and convince people to get involved, some people are happy to knock on doors. Some people will donate money. Some people will stand in the street. Some people will throw their bodies down and do civil disobedience. So that what I tell people is, don't worry about which tactic is better or worse. There's plenty of room for all. We need a lot more of all of it, and you're probably going to be more inclined to do it if you do what you feel comfortable with personally. And then besides that, I think anybody that thinks that this particular campaign or that particular campaign is somehow, they can prove to us that it will be more successful than one other, I think they're fooling themselves. I think there's so much uncertainty about which campaigns will turn out to be more or less effective that there's very little argument that, well, some of them we shouldn't have at all and some of them we should be doing only. And we spend so much of our time arguing about that. I just think it's a waste of time arguing about it because there's that much uncertainty about what's actually going to prove to be effective. If you had asked anybody to predict that Occupy Wall Street was going to be an event of anything like the magnitude that it turned out to be, and I knew people organizing in New York City who were on the ground and they were very much in touch with everybody in those communities. And they had the good sense after 1 week to realize that they had been mistaken about just what a flashpoint that was and what at least a temporarily successful raising of awareness that would prove to be. That's the way history really is. It's just a lot less predictable, than all of us who try to come up with grand strategies for progressive change would like to believe. That's my own personal opinion.
It's a great film, and it's also what UN General Secretary Antonio Guterres came out with recently. Everything, everywhere, all at once. That's what we need. But just for the person who asked the question about wealth tax, we will be putting on seminars in the autumn because we don't actually need taxes to pay for this. For a sovereign currency issuing government like the UK, the States, we can actually just create the money. The only concern we should be really worried about from a socialist or Marxist perspective is the actual real material resources of the society. It's the reason why folks, everybody wants always money for war, but not for our national health. So the issue is not the money. We don't need to raise taxes or, God forbid, engage in austerity. States are not like households. We have to earn money before we spend. States actually create the money by spending. I know it's very counterintuitive, but if you're interested in this, it's called modern monetary theory or a functional view of state finance. Read Stephanie Kelton, who was economic advisor to Theodore Bernie Sanders, where she explains that most of us have been ideologically bamboozled, including in the academy, where we have this Thatcherite handbag economics view that we have to earn the money before we spend it. It's bollocks. And it means people die. It means we can't have the money for the green transition because where are you going to get the taxes and so on? How did Britain or America fight the Second World War, just to finish? Are you on a real historical example? Churchill or Roosevelt didn't say, oh, we're going to raise the taxes. Effectively, the material resources of Britain and America were transformed politically by fiat. And that's where actually our currency is. It's fiat money. It's not backed up by gold or some commodity. It is the state backing up. And I think I'm really passionate, as you can tell, about this because I'm so sad that this university, along with every other university, mostly in European and North American context, we are producing hundreds of thousands of technically competent barbarians who study economics. They come out of school here with this completely right-wing view, which is doing so much irreparable damage because these kids then go into business, then go into policy with this stuff that we need to raise taxes or engage in austerity before we pay for things. Sorry, Robin.
No, I agree with you 100%. Modern monetary theory is really good. You know, Keynes had the essence of it way back when.
Okay. But we pay for the war.
That's right. That, you know, there's a different situation when you say, well, do I eventually have to balance my family budget? That's different from, well, does the government have to balance its budget? And the answer for the government is no, and the answer for the family is, yeah, probably. And that, of course, convinced the Germans of that. That's
all liberals. Keynes actually, just on that point, he has a wonderful phrase. He says, whatever is technically possible is financially affordable.
Yes.
And you read his wonderful essay, How Do We Pay for the War? He's really clear that the issue is the actual real material resource. Right. How do we mobilize labour, capital, and land in this? John, you want to come in?
No, but I'm happy to ask it.
Oh, sorry, that's
that's all right. It's a Chinese detour, and I mean, kind of the two bits of good news, if you can call it that, for in terms of their challenging presentation, was the thing about the e-cars basically in the States and the Chinese delivery over their quota. And I wonder, might you say something, what do you think is going on there? I suppose I should declare, as a Communist Party member for over 50 years, I wouldn't accept your definition of a Marxist-Leninist position. In fact, what you described around the Occupy movement is much closer to a Leninist position, I would suggest, than the stereotypical, well, it's all kind of rigid Stalinists doing what they're told. In fact, same with my own party, the movement and the real world trade union experience of attitudes towards, say, the nuclear industry or other ecologically disastrous policies which the party and the trade union movement committed to. But it's real world does teach you things, and I think the tradition I come from understands that and is interested to be part of these sort of discussions and try to sort out what the reality is that we're experiencing. But back to my question, why do you think that those two things were achievable? The e-card, but in particular the Chinese experience. You see the two different possibilities there: big state on one hand and getting ahead of the economic curve, I think you put it.
Are you friends with Pat Devine? Are you friends with Pat Devine? Okay.
Or Patsy Devine?
No, it's Patrick Devine, University of Manchester. No, okay. Pat and I are longtime friends, and once I was visiting him up there, and he opened his wallet, pulled out his Communist Party membership card, and told me that he thought This was after the party had dissolved. So I think I'm the only one left who has one of these. Pat and I have talked and agree about many things about post-capitalist models, et cetera, over the years. And that's why I just thought maybe. China, okay? I don't really. China has an authoritarian political system, and it now has a largely capitalist economy. But it's by no means a neoliberal political system and capitalist economy. There's a great deal of planning that goes on. And if you actually look at just sort of economic growth rates and success, one of the reasons that I believe that at some point in the 21st century, the reputation in the public mind of planning rather than free marketing will at some point take a turn, and people will realize that good planning works better than no planning. And I think that in large part, the relative success of the Chinese, economy over the past 30 years is because they've done a lot more planning than countries like the United States or Great Britain have. Doesn't mean it's democratic. I certainly don't support the political system. But it's also the major new player on our planet, and will have a huge impact, on what can and can't be done. In terms of climate policy, they are not the obstacle. They are not the obstacle to international progress on climate policy. And I feel very grateful for that we have a new superpower on the planet, and it actually is not the one that's holding up the works with international negotiations. They have been eminently reasonable on that subject, compared particularly to the United States, but also to Europe. I don't endorse their social system. I don't endorse their political system. It's not really social democratic capitalism either. But it certainly is a capitalism with a lot more government involvement in terms of what it is they'll allow or not. And it's what allows them to say, well, the EVs are the way to go. They're the way to go for climate reasons, and they're actually the way to go for international competition in markets, profitable markets. So we're going to go ahead and subsidize that industry. And yes, they have proven to be more capable of pushing their economy rapidly to do certain things than the European and U.S. governments have, and sometimes that has been for the better.
If you want an argument for good planning, ask the chief executive officer of Walmart, Apple, Google. These are huge, economies that are often the size and bigger of whole countries. They are organized internally in a planned manner. So it's absolute nonsense to think we cannot plan an economy. How does Walmart actually operate? The world's biggest corporation. And I think that's insufficiently recognized in terms of the real world examples. That's how we can use real time, information technology and supply chain management and so on. And I think you're right on China. I mean, we're in an age now where maybe what we need to focus on is resource mobilization and not always resource efficiency. China is very good at just moving resources really, really quickly. Yes, there's losses of efficiency, as the orthodox economists would put it, but that is the type of response we're going to need in an emergency. The response in an emergency is not efficiency, that, if you like, use an analogy, I often use these in terms of teaching, lower the rims. I think often eco-socialists or Marxist-Leninists like me, we're like the elves. We have these beautifully eloquent, worked out visions of the future. What we need are orcs, because orcs get shit done. They may not be elegant, they may not actually be pretty, but they get shit done. And that's the age we're now coming into. It's not only about research.
Did I hear you call the Chinese orcs? No.
No,
that's not.
It's not a
quotation.
It's not. I want to say, if anybody who's interested in economic planning, like me, so I'll call it myself an orc in that way. But it's getting over. It apparently speaks to the urgency of your talk, Robin. I do want to come back and have a question about growth and degrowth, because given that's my area, I won't ask that now. But what I take from your talk is that there's no ideological or normative commitment to a kind of a green social democracy using markets. It's a pragmatic position that you're simply saying that we don't have the social forces, I used to call them, sufficient for a radical revolutionary transition to eco-socialism.
Fast enough.
Fast enough.
I'm not pessimistic. Maybe grandchildren, I have some of them. Great-grandchildren, I'm pretty optimistic for my great-grandchildren.
I can see now a new essay from you, like using Keynes as one, eco-socialist possibilities for my great-great-grandchildren. But before I get into the questions of growth and degrowth and decoupling and so on, anybody else either online or in the room want to ask a question who hasn't spoken yet? Jane.
I was just wondering, not in terms of degrowth or steady state, in terms of the recent introduction of Inflation Reduction Act in the US.
Which the acronym is really, really bad here in the north of Ireland.
But not in that context, but in the American context. It really left me puzzled because, in a sense, it was trying to protect the domestic automobile industry within the US, especially companies producing EVs, whereas also cutting subsidies, companies from China, Japan, and Korea. So I was wondering, what kind of is, economic protectionism is, and how is it going together with, let's say, any kind of climate policy?
Okay.
What does it mean?
The act. First of all, the name is just total propaganda.
Yeah, that's what I thought.
They chose that name because they thought it was politically expedient to say this was an anti-inflation bill. It has nothing to do with being anti-inflation. So in that sense, it's laughable. Second thing is that the early versions of it were hugely better than what got actually passed. And if you want to know why, his name is Joe Manchin. One senator. One senator took out huge chunks of good program in that act as the price for his vote. It was actually a second senator. It was Sinema. We had two senators, on the Democratic side, who watered down that piece of legislation tremendously. It would have been much, much better had it passed in anything like its original form. Is it a new form of economic nationalism on the part of the U.S. government? Yes. The Biden wing of the Democratic Party, and the unions in the United States, just as the unions are everywhere, are very supportive of government programs that bolster up large domestic industries with many union employees. So yes, this was Biden, working with the unions, engaging in the kind of international economic policy that, for instance, Bill Clinton had abandoned. The other thing that's interesting is that the Republican Party, which traditionally would have been less prone to doing that, is also now prone to do that as a Trump party. So whether it's the Democratic Party or the Trump Republican Party in power in the United States, I think it would be very foolish not to expect more things along those lines.
We must always refer to the US Act. In this part of the word is IRA. Think about that. Any other questions? Okay. My growth issue.
Yes.
And so on. So as a growth agnostic or post-growth political economist, I mean, I think there's a lot of confusion around this debate in terms of, on the one hand,
Read so far.
Read so.
It might be the last place to read, so let's celebrate the
everything was going swimmingly. And then two white beardy guys, and then suddenly this came along. On the one hand, you know, a bit like carbon is my view. We should thank growth and carbon for all they've achieved. A bit like the Monty Python sketch, it's a dead parrot. Give it a good burial and wake and move on. So there's one issue: why fetishize or promote GDP growth developed in a capitalist way and so we continue it in a post-capitalist sense? Because most of us agree what we want are good jobs, well-paid, good conditions, unionized, good public services, cheap, affordable public transportation, free public transportation actually, that pay for itself in terms of the benefits. So it's like, what are the things we want? And at best, growth is an extremely imperfect measure and means to get there. And certainly my own understanding of post-growth is, and the reason why I don't use degrowth, you're as welcome as a fart in a spacesuit, because it suffers from a really bad communicative landing, particularly with working class communities, where they are not consuming enough. So that's a misnomer of the post-growth position, that it means, oh my God, every sector of the economy has to collapse. It is not that at all. It actually goes right to the heart of what Robin was talking about, of the need for macroeconomic planning. We have now established scientifically the planetary boundaries. 9 planetary boundaries. Johan Rockström, the Stockholm Environment Institute, established this. We've now transgressed 4 of them. The biodiversity loss, the 6th great mass extinction, the climate change, nitrogen oxide. And the post-growth position, and this is where Kate Raworth's donut model, that some of you may be familiar with, is really useful to kind of visualize this. The post-growth position is simply, we have to keep the macroeconomy within the sustainability limits of the regenerative capacities of the earth, its ability to absorb pollution, and so on. And at the same time, make sure that nobody falls below social floor. So the donut is the sweet spot in the middle. And my view is, if we engage in economic planning or in economic policy, which delivers good jobs, good public services, the things we want in life, food, energy, housing, and so on. And if statistically GDP growth goes up, fine. So you see, it should be seen as a remainder, not as the main focus, because if we go back to the remarks I made earlier on, my focus as a Marxian, I mean, this comes out as a Marxist, but certainly a Marxian-inspired political economist, it's the real material assets of a society. That's all we should be really concerned about. So for me, I'm interested in, I don't know what, steady state economy, Herman Daly and so on, far too pro-capitalist in my view, in their iterations and so on. But for me, a post-growth position is absolutely compatible with everything that I think we could all agree upon. And it's almost like you get a sense, this is like the scholastic debates of angels on pinheads. It's a waste often of energy. I do disagree with the language of degrowth, particularly as many of us here, are involved in politics. In working class communities, they want growth. They want more. And we have the evidence now that the vast majority of the greenhouse gas emissions causing planetary chaos is not from the working class. It's from the elite and the global middle class, which sadly many of us are probably a member of as well, by the way. So the issue here is about redistribution of the available resources, which is still compatible of moving, in my view, into a post-GDP growth economy. And I don't know whether, that's a better way for you to respond than, somehow that we're incompatible. We are incompatible. But it's just, I was curious as to why, because you mentioned, I think, development, human living standards, great. So that's what degrowthers would agree with as well. All they're arguing is that GDP growth, a term actually, by the way, that was invented by a lot of dead white men from Europe in the 1930s, particularly a man called Simon Kuznets, which actually became very useful for the American planning of the war. Because when you have a measurement of the economy like that, it's a separate shin scale, as they say, Australia. So anyway, I'll stop there, Robin, in terms of, would you agree with what I'm saying here, that growth should be seen as a remainder, not as the focus?
I agree with you more than I thought I was going to.
Stop the camera. I agree with you.
And if everybody who talked to if we agree that degrowth is a non-starter, even if for no other reason, just it's a political. As you said, go to working class communities and tell them that they should sign up for economic degrowth.
Nobody historically ever righted for austerity,
right?
As far as I know.
Well, I actually think of it more. I will put it more this way, just in terms of politically. We have 7 billion people on the planet. 3 billion of them are seriously suffering for a lack of economic well-being. Seriously suffering. Now, if you are aspiring to be a movement representing the interests of and winning the political support from, the wretched of the earth, you really want to go and tell them that, sorry, planetary limits have been reached. There's no hope for a better life for you, your children, your grandchildren. I mean, I think it's just such bad politics. I also think it's sort of indulgently upper middle class. If you're upper middle class, you might quite sensibly come to the conclusion, I don't really need a much higher standard of living. And maybe I would actually be wiser taking lower income and material consumption and more leisure. So I see it as it's a convenient thing for somebody to preach who sort of, that's their status of life. And if that's the kind of movement you want to build, well, then that's who you're going to get to sign on. So those are the principal reasons that I just, that I think it's, and I think that's not what you want either. So,
I don't know who you're reading in the post-growth movement that will have that position. Frankly, there is a recognition that the only way we can lift people out of poverty in the global south is by those of us in the global north going on a climate carbon diet. We have enough wealth, even in Northern Ireland. The issue is redistribution, which is the old left-wing socialist position, which I think in a post-growth context, distributional politics are much sharper. Right. And that's the only way biophysically
and I also agree with that. I mean, I describe the two great events of the last 40 years as we're dangerously close to having reached cataclysmic climate change. First through sort of ignorance, not realizing what was going on, and then the fossil fuel industry has basically done the rest to just take us along this trajectory and obstructed every attempt to sort of come to awareness. And the other one is the incredible increase in inequality of income. So if you ask me, should we be focusing on redistribution? Absolutely yes. So in that, I think we're also in agreement. It's more, I mean, maybe I'm a nitpicker for logic. And let me put it this way. So in decreasing the amount of hours it works to make the same thing, which we call increasing labor productivity. Is that a good thing? Because essentially what growth, I mean, you really want that to shrink? That would be degrowth. You really want to say we want no more increases in labor productivity? I mean, growth means growth of labor productivity. And, you know, until leisure becomes as pleasurable as work, then it seems to me that that is a good thing. And particularly when you have billions of people, you know, who need more productivity, then, you know, you don't want to just go out there and say, we don't aspire to that anymore. Now, but here's the problem. And here's the situation that we need to deal with. Well, it doesn't just take labor to make things. It also takes inputs from the natural environment. So just as you can have an increase in labor productivity, you can conceivably have an increase in, call it environmental throughput efficiency. And those things aren't impossible. Just like we have new technologies that we can, now, so in my view, we need to focus on new technologies that accomplish two things. The same thing we always were focused on, which is any new technologies that develop, that increase our labor productivity, well, that's usually a good thing. And any new technologies that increase our environmental efficiency. We produce the same goods and services, but with fewer inputs from the natural environment. That's a good thing too. And now that we understand that there are environmental limits, then in some sense, that becomes, we have two goals now. But if we are as efficient at increasing environmental efficiency as we are at increasing labor efficiency, then that's what puts no extra pressure on the environment. Now, in a lot of areas, we need to not only put no more extra pressure on the environment, we need to put far less than we already have, with greenhouse gases being at the top of the list. So you have to have absolute decoupling, not just relative decoupling on, and it isn't just. The other thing, though, here's the other thing that bothers me. So I say, okay, EVs are good. Why? Because the problem right now is we're putting the greenhouse gases, and the EVs don't do that. Oh, but you know, to make batteries, the EVs, we need some minerals. Yeah. And that's a problem that would become a serious problem 175 years from now. So part of my feeling, and this is also a very unpopular thing to say. What is environmental sustainability reduced to? It basically reduces to kicking the can down the road. You're about to run out of this environmental input. Well, you've got to stop using it. When you stop using it, that's the greenhouse gas emissions. Oh, you're going to use more of something else. But if that other thing is still in greater supply and you've got more time to buy, and then by the time we get to running out of whatever that was that we were putting in the batteries, we're going to have to come up with something else to substitute for it. So I think that is, and I know that most people in the environmental movement, that way of thinking about that's really what we're all about is almost unacceptable. It's an unacceptable way to think about it. But I think that is the only way that makes sense to think about it. And the sooner we own up to that and kind of figure that out and start thinking that way, the better off we're going to be.
Two quick comments on that. Somebody else hasn't spoken. One is, my position is that we have to abandon GDP growth as a permanent feature of the economy. As a temporary, absolutely. We also need to attend to the undifferentiated nature of GDP. GDP does not care if you're selling porno mags or Bibles. It doesn't tell us anything about the equitable or unequitable distribution. We've even had the experience where you're going after today, Robin, in the Republic of Ireland, of jobless economic growth. Economic growth, that doesn't mean to say, you know, you can find other forms of economic growth that might benefit. So we've had this jobless experience and it's not actually benefited people. But the other thing is that at the scale of the economy, I'm willing to accept that on certain noxious pollution, we'll have to look into the EV example from America you said. As far as I can see, I cannot find any empirical evidence that we can decouple at the macroeconomic scale a growing economy while still staying within the sustainability limits. And if our issue really is about the things in life that we need, food, energy, water, housing, shelter, meaningful free time, you know, we have all the technologies we need, in my view, to make the transition now. It's things like a 3-day working week, democratizing workplaces, and so on. So in everything we've been discussing, I don't think it's anything necessarily incompatible. I think they're both quite, you know, compatible. But I do think we need to start, as I said, that GDP growth, a bit like capitalism as Marx described it. He was positive about capitalism. It was a necessary stage in historical development, but the same with growth and carbon. I think we have to acknowledge, and I think we have to be grateful and thankful for all those fossil fuel workers, because the real danger in the strategy question Damien asked, that a lot of people, whether it's in agriculture in Ireland, because that's the biggest greenhouse gas emitter, or in the fossil fuel sectors, they feel vilified by environmentalists. And actually they're not. They should be thanked. And that's what the just transition idea is. That came from the trade union movement in America, about making sure nobody's left behind. So I have a sense, Robin, we're going to have you back again, where we're going to have a more rounded discussion on this. But I don't want to monopolize the conversation. Anybody else, either online or in the room, that like to, who hasn't spoken? I know then you want to get back in, but if anyone who hasn't spoken yet like to.
Yes. Let's do two last things. Look, I'm the last person in the world to defend the way that GDP is measured, or GDP per capita. There's a huge literature out there pointing out all the ways in which GDP per capita mismeasures sort of the average growth and economic well-being. Second thing, I have never believed or argued that we have multiple goals for the economy. One would be economic democracy. I would prioritize that more than I would prioritize. So we have economic democracy, we have economic justice, and then we have economic efficiency, which basically in some ways you could translate that into, do we want technologies that increase labor productivity? And then one of the things that was never added until it was way too late was we want environmental sustainability. So I am somebody that believes in multiple economic goals, and in terms of, if you ask me to prioritize them, I wouldn't put economic, growth of average well-being at the top. On the other hand, you've got to do something. I mean, I would prioritize, the economic well-being of the bottom 3 billion people on the planet. And I would prioritize the economic well-being of an increasing percentage of the population of the more advanced economies that are in very miserable condition and have enjoyed no growth in their economic well-being for going on 30 years now. So in those regards, I don't think we're so far.
Help it two really white guys, anyway. We're also Green Party members as well. I'm going to leave you, before we thank Robin, with two kind of pen pictures. The first one is the GDP hero is an overweight hamburger-eating alcoholic driving their car while crashing it and making a 20-car pileup while on the phone to the divorce lawyer to divorce their wife. Every step.
But it is a Big Mac, though, right?
It is a Big Mac. We don't have Wendy's over here. But every step of that horror story I've just described, ching, 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 they all add to GDP. The GDP villain is a sandal-wearing, bicycle vegan who makes their own food. And it's also an issue that I know Jane, who's written a lot on this. And again, I think it was Keynes, I mean, forgive him his sexism at the time. Why is it when a man marries his housemaid, GDP goes down? There's a whole area of reproductive labour that GDP simply does not capture, because these white guys in the 1930s decided the arms industry was to be included. Even though Simon Kuznets, who was the Russian-American who invented it, he said that's not adding anything good to society. But with advertising, there's so many things that we include in GDP which actually is detrimental to society. But actually, the other image I want to leave you with, and again, it's a way of myself and Robin coming to consensus, not that I don't think we were. I think it's often with these things, it's a difference of language and where you begin from. Even though I'm a keen cyclist, I also have an electric car as well. And the analogy is based on a car. When you drive a car, and the car is the economy, you don't just look like the speedometer. That's what GDP growth is. If you measure the circulation of the buying and selling of goods and services, you've got to look at the tire pressure, have you got enough oil, and so on. And that's the kind of macroeconomic planning we need, where we're measuring public health, the mental health of our populations, what's our Gini coefficient, you know, how unequal is our society. All of these things should be included. So it's not about dethroning GDP and saying we're not going to use it, but it should only be one amongst a series of measures that we're using to plan the economy in a way that's sustainable and just. So thank you, Robin, for coming back and breaking out in consensus. Can I ask you all to give Robin a warm thank you?